Welcome to Focus the Nation 2008, what is hopefully the first of an annual event that will be taking place across the United States from now until who knows when. We are one of at least 1,700 other academic institutions throughout the U.S. participating in today's event. It's also being held at other religious organizations, community organizations, different primary and secondary schools. Today's event is basically, it's being held in order to foster more of a focus towards the issue of climate change and global warming.
I am a professor of earth science. I take the long view of climate. I study ice age climates from the past 20, 50, 100,000 years ago. I will give you a brief introduction as to some of the possible reasons why our planet is currently warming, and there is no doubt that it is. The data is unequivocal at this point. We have very good temperature records. The general trend over the last, since 1900, are a period of gradual warming from about 1910 to about 1940, a very gradual decline for about 20 or 30 years until about 1965, and then after 1965 there's been a relatively rapid and steady increase in global average temperature up until the current year. So in terms of the Earth, there's three different things we can do. The first thing we can do is we can, or the sun can become more bright, or it can become more dim. That might change the temperature of the Earth. The Earth can absorb less energy. More sunlight gets reflected back into outer space without being absorbed. And the third variability is we can decrease the amount of energy that is radiated away from the surface back into outer space. And that is determined by the strength of the greenhouse.
Well, on average, in the Northeast right now, there's about 10 to 15 days each year where the temperature is above 90 degrees. At the end of this century, it's predicted that we will be experiencing about 60 days above the temperature of 90 degrees and 14 to 28 days above the temperature of 100. A number of people talk about retiring and then moving to Florida. I submit to you it won't be necessary, because by the time that happens, Florida will have moved to us in terms of the climate that we'll be now experiencing. In fact, the Union of Concerned Scientists states in a recent report that we will have the current climate of South Carolina in that time frame. We know that the impacts that global warming is bringing are in fact quite dire. The rise of ocean levels, the threat of flooding coastal low-lying areas, and taking into consideration certain countries like Bangladesh, majority of the country lie below sea level, or where we are right now used to be called Back Bay. It still is Back Bay because it used to be a tidal swamp, and even much of Massachusetts would have to begin building seawalls to keep out the ocean. That's assuming that the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets do not melt. Most models do not necessarily think that will happen anytime soon, but if so, then we're looking at a 20-foot rise in sea levels. 40% of the world's population derives the majority of their drinking water from glacial melt. The drying up of glaciers threatens an acute water crisis for millions and millions of people from all over the world. We also know the impacts of declining crop yields and famine. It's estimated that, in fact, hundreds of millions of people will suffer from food and water shortages as a result of global warming. So clearly the cost of not acting now are going to be minuscule in compared to the type of damage which is going to occur to societies all around the world in the not too distant future.
But climate change is one of those really interesting public policy problems, because it really encompasses a whole multitude of disciplines, and it's truly, a global situation. It's the ultimate public policy problem, because the only way it's going to get solved is if nations cooperate, if nations come together. It's the only way it's going to happen, because it's not a regional issue, it's a global issue. And so the issue that we've been working on is to look at the implications for jobs, both on the benefit side and the cost side, if you do something or if you don't do something. Looking at incomes and wealth, which are connected to jobs, which industries win, which industries lose. Looking at equity considerations, fairness issues, because this truly is, a world that's populated with the haves and the have-nots. And when you look at climate change issues, it's the areas populated by the have-nots that are the hardest ones hit. And so the question is, are we going to be altruistic and try and do something that may not benefit the U.S. at all? In fact, there's some evidence that climate change would actually help the U.S. economy in the short run, not in the long run, but in the short run. In the long run, however, you know that there are countries that are going to disappear because of sea level rise. The most popular policy being discussed to date is the so-called cap and trade system, where you cap emissions and then you allow permits to be associated with those emissions, and those permits can be traded in financial markets. So people can, in essence, buy the right to pollute. Now, that's not as bad as it sounds, because what you're doing is you're clamping down on emissions worldwide. And then you're allowing the most efficient producers that can really minimize their emissions to do as much as they possibly can and gain economically. And the ones that are going to struggle, the ones for whom the readjustment to a lower emissions climate is going to be really painful and economically harmful, not only to them but to everybody, they get they get to buy their way out, and the market will figure this out. So that's the rationale. The alternative is to impose a carbon tax where you just tax all emissions. And that tends to be the one that most economists favor. These are equivalent. In other words, you can design policies so they're exactly the same. It's just that the benefits and losers are going to be a little bit different under each of these configurations. And finally, there's just an out-and-out command type of policy where you just sit there and say, you won't admit. Your emissions were X number of millions of tons carbon dioxide equivalent 5 years ago. That's the limit.
So federally, we just saw the passage of the 2007 Energy Act. I'm not going to focus on everything because I never get through it all, but I'll focus on sort of the highlights. One of the big things that we see happen is the movement on CAFE standards, which are the car and truck fuel efficiency standards, up to 35 miles per gallon in 2020. A lot of the auto industry said this just can't be done. Most people say we could see these kinds of technological innovations occur probably even faster. So that was a nice success. Secondly, technology investment. A lot of people, Amory Lovins and others, have said what we need to see is a Manhattan Project of research, development, and innovation on a worldwide basis, and certainly within the United States, make the U.S. a leader in environmental and carbon reduction. We don't yet have a Manhattan Project-like path, but we certainly got a good start within the energy bill that just was passed. A wide variety of incentives for research and development at the university level, and in a wide variety of different areas across the U.S. And then lastly, the energy bill had a wide set of incentives. These are incentives for renewable development, renewable energy, conservation, and a wide variety of other issues. We're seeing in states a lot more cooperative action. So here in the Northeast, Massachusetts and all the Northeast states are part of something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI. This is, I think it's now 14 states in the Northeast that have all gotten together and say, well, we're going to implement a carbon trading program until we get one on a national level. And so it's nice to see this sort of cooperative action going. Last issue, on a smaller basis, a lot of states are doing something that we call smart growth, which is creating sustainable, environmentally sound communities based on encouraging commuters, encouraging walkable, livable cities, very dense living so that houses aren't spread out like those McMansions that you see in the suburbs, right? And this is to create communities that are, number one, really pleasant to be in, and number two, that are environmentally sound and reduce energy use in a wide variety of different ways. And here in Massachusetts, again, to sort of harp on the bipartisan thing, we've seen both Republican and Democratic governors pursue smart growth policies.
So in many ways, the challenge that we all face as citizens is to restore our democracy. It's fundamentally an issue about democracy and putting in place a government which is going to enact policies which reflect the will of the American people, that is willing to engage in negotiations with other countries and undertake its fair share of the responsibility in reducing its role in greenhouse gases.